Hello guys, this is Axter from the Players Council, and today in this video I'm going to focus on a request from one of the members of the community who asked specifically for some kind of analysis of how to beat certain strategies. In other words, if the meta are, for example, dwarves, what can I do to beat them in the most efficient way? I already wanted to go through something that we call meta, so let's break it down right now. Meta means the decks which are generally played and which are positioned in the top ranks of the tournaments in the local play group. So let's say that you are from the Czech Republic, such as I am. There you have a group of 30 or 40 active people who come on a regular basis to the local events, and these guys have their preferences, they have their decks that they are experienced with, or they just believe in their power, and they would come to the tournaments where they take these decks repetitively, and because they are so experienced with them, they very often end up in the top ranks. So what they play is called meta. That means that the, let's say, top 3 players of such a tournament are probably going to play something that is meta. That means the most efficient, the best there is, because the best deck probably has the highest chances to get to such a high position. I'm going to give you an example. We will take a look at Alliance and Corsairs. This deck is very universal. It is able to withstand great force that ranges from Swarm to Corruption, and therefore you are able to potentially win the tournament no matter what the meta is, and that makes this deck the meta. Is it unbeatable? Well, definitely not, because then this deck would always be in the top position. But it depends on many factors, such as how people react to knowing that you are going to select this deck for the upcoming tournament, how the draw goes, and also how many mistakes and which mistakes players make during the matches in the events. Another example of that could be Ents and Southrons, a very strong deck as well. On the other hand, it is very different to the previous one. The first one, the alliance with Corsairs, focuses mainly on free peoples, which is very resilient, and the shadow mainly stops or punishes double moves. In this deck, however, it is still very much free peoples oriented, but the shadow is able to win much more likely against certain strategies than the Corsairs. So there's a slight variation between these two decks, but these two, at least in my opinion, are probably two of the best decks that you can choose to go to the tournament with. Now there's one very important thing that I need to note right now. I am speaking about a Decipher movie format with a variation which is now applied to the Czech Republic events, and that is that Galadriel, Lady Redeemed, may not be played in any of the decks, and also it is not possible to combine a Corsair Marauder plus Goblin Scimitar combination. Why is that? Well, because we decided with the people in the local play group that if these cards were allowed, then such a meta would be created which would very much limit what people could play. For instance, if you let Galadriel, Lady Redeemed unbanned, then Corsairs become much weaker, and that affects the selection of the decks that players can come to the tournaments with, which is something that we try to avoid at all costs, because if the amount of decks you are able to play in order to win the tournament is very small or very low, then that is going to kill creativity and fun, the playing experience from the overall tournament, and that is bad for the business. So I keep speaking about this word meta. We have basically broken down what it is all about. It comes down to the best stuff that you can play in the format, and that is the best in the current time or in the time that you decide to play. Now, how to respond to that? If you don't want to be the player that takes the meta, such as this deck for instance, Ents and Sovereigns, then you can play reactively. If you know that the 3 most favorite candidates for the top 3 positions are going to select this deck, then you can react to that. Now, how do we do that? In general, it is probably possible to create some kind of Excel sheet in which you write all the possible decks from Free Peoples and Shadows, and then you make some kind of comparison, like dwarves beat, for example, Corsairs or Besiegers, then Ents beat Besiegers and Morgul Swarm, and then Mass Archery beats Hillman, etc. And you could go on like this and until you do a complete analysis of the format. But that list would have to get updated very often, because players would not want to get beaten by the same stuff over and over again. They would definitely want to react to it somehow. And let's take a look at how to react. I have prepared something which I called anti-meta or / counter cards. And the way you want to react to what the current meta is, that you basically play a lot of copies of a certain card which is very strong against what your opponents are going to play. And in general, it can be said that there is an answer to everything in this movie format, which I spoke about a while ago. And it is mostly true for all other formats, except for some which are not so popular, probably due to this reason. Simply because the same decks repeat in the top 8 in some main events, and they generally do not change. They are always there because there is no response. And that is, in my opinion, a definition of a bad format, because it kills creativity. That's why I have always preferred movie to Fellowship, because in Fellowship you are most likely always going to see Urks, Moria and Nazgul. Now, back to what I was saying. Let's say that the meta are the Ents with Southerns. Now, how can you respond to that? A perfect response would be playing Ents yourself against the Southerns and playing 4 copies of Have Patience. You can test this with one of your friends or ask somebody on GAMP to playtest this with you, and I guarantee you that if you play the Ents which I showed a while ago, and you have 4 copies of Have Patience, the Southerns are never going to beat you. Literally. Now, a reaction to the Ents. Some of you who have played the Saved from the Fire decks definitely know how painful it is to run into Sauron on side 2 after you have played Saved from the Fire, because then 2 companions are going to die, and depending on your build and draw, most likely you are going to have a very hard time playing any more companions, because some of the companions in the Ents deck say spot 2 Ent companions. So Sauron beats 2, he puts them into that pile, and then you really have a hard time dealing with that situation. So creating an Ents deck with 4 copies of this, maybe cutting Servant completely, if you know that Southerns are going to be the meta, would then be very easy for you if you want to beat that certain player. And having 4 copies of Sauron and 30 cards in Free Peoples and Shadow side, and also if Sauron doesn't come to your open hand, then mulliganing into 6 is most likely going to give you Sauron into your hand, and it is going to punish your opponents saved from the fire. That will put you ahead, and if you do not make too many mistakes, you are then going to be the victorious in that particular match. Let's take a look at another example. We can take a look at Saved Gondor, for instance. This is a very resilient deck. Ents are probably still a tiny little bit better than Saved Gondor due to its immunity against corruption, but the Saved Gondor deck also has a very easy time against Hillman, because Elendil just makes fun of anything the Hillmen are going to try to do. So how can you deal with such a deck? Well, if you keep taking Hillman into a meta where everybody plays Saved Gondor with Elendil, well, then you are going to have a really hard time achieving anything. You will most likely only beat the players who do not play the Saved Gondor. In hands of an experienced player, this deck is never going to lose against Hillman, no matter what. But let's adjust the no matter what a little bit. Let's say that I do what I mentioned a while ago. I add 4 copies of Sauron. Now this deck in particular plays no possessions, so that means I don't need Warclub. It also doesn't specifically kill any minions in archery phase, so I can discard Hillman Horde. And maybe I don't need too much strength, because this is all going to be about playing Sauron after Saved from the Fire, and then usually just waiting for my opponent's double move and play Sauron again, which would be very difficult for my opponent with this deck to deal with. So for that reason, I could play only 3 times, burn every village. And this is how you react to certain decks. Now, just to make clear what I just did, I adjusted my normal build according to the expected meta. I was expecting that somebody would be playing Saved Gondor. Then to my build of Hillman, I would put 4 copies of Sauron in it, which would punish my opponents for playing this super universal deck. And now back to our cards and why I think they are going to be so efficient. So here we have a very simple card from the 3rd set. Such a little thing. Normally it is mostly used in Fellowship block, but why not use it in movie? One of my friends, Bizi from the Czech community, actually inspired me to mention this thing right here in this video, because the Saved Gondor can be played either with Isildur or with Boromir. And if people in the current meta play Boromir, well, then the easiest thing you can do is play some sort of Moria with Cave Troll, add 4 copies of this, and you are going to win every time, because Boromir will not be able to withstand what you put against him. So we have discussed this as a sort of dealing against mass archery. We have discussed this as a way against Boromir. We have discussed Sauron as a way of dealing with Saved from the Fire decks. Now what are the other things for? Sam, obviously, is a way to deal with corruption. So that is always going to be a very simple way how to deal with a meta of corruption, but because he is such an easy counter to corruption, corruption is never going to be meta in this format. You would have to ban some in your local playgroup in order to make some higher chances for the meta play in form of corruption. If your opponents like to play Swarm a lot, then the easiest thing would be to play something like Telepathy, which is a deck that looks something like this. And then, instead of playing the 2 standard copies of Curse Their Foul Feet, you can play 4 copies. And again, your opponents are never going to do anything to you, because the way Swarm works is not that you play a minion whenever it comes, but you usually wait for 8 minions in hand, then you play them all, and you hope to kill your opponent, or at least put a very satisfactory amount of wounds on board, which either stops him or kills him in the long run. But if you reset his count of minions in hand by this card, even 2 times in the game, that is going to be GG for you. Now, why to play it 4 times? Because you need to play some cards in order to beat the other strategies. You are not going to face only one type of deck throughout the whole tournament. So, if you play 4 copies, you increase the chance of defeating your opponent's Swarm strategies, like this. Back to our anti-cards. So once again, this we have mentioned, this as well, and now we are down to 6 more types of cards. If Ninja Golem is the thing that people play the most, then nothing prevents you from playing 4 copies of Clever Hobbits. You can actually play this card in any deck. You don't even have to spot Smeagol or Golem or anything. So that's a very simple way how to defeat that deck if it is considered meta. Now again, if your opponent plays Corsairs, he is going to be heavily reliant on possessions. So playing Gandalf with 4 copies of Roll of Thunder is going to give your opponent a very hard time of doing anything to you throughout the entire game. And you probably already play 2 to 3 copies of this if you play Gandalf. So adjusting the amount to 4 is not going to, drive you away from your original direction. Now, if Mordor is the meta, that could be the Besiegers in the movie format, or perhaps the advanced Mordor minions, which are actually a very solid force, then you can play Elves with 4 copies of Stand Against Darkness. And that is a very, very simple way how to deal with Mordor, because as they are all roaming to side 6, discarding 1 minion for 1 Twilight and an Exert is always going to be very difficult for an opponent to deal with. Actually, a card which I forgot to add is a way of Mordor with dealing with this, and that would be Terrible as Dawn. Let's say that people decided to play Telepathy, and in some extreme scenario they play 4 copies of Curse because half the meta is Swarm, and they play 4 copies of Stand Against Darkness because the other half of meta are Besiegers. Then they have 4 copies of Forearmed, 2 copies of Sirdan, and for the more experienced players, you probably know to what I'm going with this kind of deck. It's very difficult to beat with if you are one of the players playing the meta. Now, how to respond to that? Telepathy, in a format where Galadriel, Lady Redeemed, will usually have the Ring Bearer Galadriel. And the very simple way how to deal with her is 4 copies of Terrible as the Dawn. Usually, playing it twice on one side is going to decide the game, because your opponent will either have to discard 2 key companions, or Galadriel is going to die. So that is a very simple response. Now if your opponent plays Alliance and he has 4 copies of cards, 4 copies of Stand Against Darkness, and he is going to have Frodo, you might say, well, okay, now he's safe against everything. And usually these decks also play 4 copies of Aragorn, Ranger of the North. So he's extra safe against Swarm. This plus Sun is going to make sure that Corruption never beats it. He plays Greenleaf and Glorfindel, so some very strong minions are usually not going to be very strong against it. But then, this kind of deck is going to get such a stuck hand that it is never going to work. That's why people do not play so many copies of counter cards in the deck, because then, statistically, it just doesn't work out. So it's nonsense to exaggerate so much with the counter cards. Alright, let's take a look at the last 3 cards. If Gandalf is the meta, then you can play 2 Great and Terrible, but careful about this. Solo Nazgul are not very good in movie block, so we are mainly talking about Fellowship block with this card. If a lot of players play Gandalf as their key companion in the deck in the meta, then you can play some sort of Nazgul build with 4 copies of this. And then you are going to give them a very hard time, because either Gandalf dies, which is usually bad for their build, or he gets exhausted and the opponent has to stop, which is also good for you. If some sort of mass archery is the meta, then you can play Isengard Worker, which simply prevents any archer abilities from being used. So that's a simple way of dealing with that. And again, one thing that just came to my mind, and that is Foul Creation. We are now talking mainly about Fellowship block, because if your opponents tend to play these guys, which prevent you from playing from using your archery special abilities, you can play 4 copies of this. And then what can the Shadow do? The Shadow can simply react with playing there we go. No business of ours, in order to prevent revealing the hand by the free people's player, which is exactly what Foul Creation does. So as you can see, meta is never going to stay the same. People are going to react to what the other players in the top corners of the tournaments are playing, in order to have a higher chance of beating them. That's why I think movie block is generally such a great format to play in the highest ranked highest ranked tournaments, because the meta is never going to stop and it's always going to be interesting. The last card on this list is Grima, Chief Counselor. So this is a very specific card that punishes opponents for playing 4 cultures in their decks. In movie block in general, there is not going to be much motivation for you to cross the limit of 3 cultures, 3 free people's cultures, that is. So usually when you build dwarfs, your deck consists 70 or 80% of that particular culture. Same goes for Gandalf, Gondor, Rohan, some elves, and so on. So this card is not going to get used as often, but there are definitely some builds, such as the mass archery, which I mentioned before, which plays a little bit of everything. A simple example right now to show you. You are going to have Gondor, and then of course some elven archers. You are going to have Elwyn to kill off the guys that actually survive the first part of the game. Then you could also have perhaps some hobbits in order to deal with corruption, and that is going to be it. So let's say something like that. So once your opponent crosses the limit of 4 free people sculptures, then you can simply play Grima, put 2 companions into the opponent's hand, and then you are going to win the game on that very side, because it is devastating. But as I said, this is not going to happen very often, especially not in the most popular formats that are played currently. Now the last thing that we are going to take a look at, we are going to take a deck and we are going to build it from scratch, and then I'm going to suggest some meta and we are going to add some cards to the deck. So let's say that we want to play dwarfs, a very simple deck. Now when I build a deck, I always want to start with the core cards. So it has been out there for a very long time. The core of the deck is Durin with Linar, and then the ring pair is Gimli with some solid ring. Now I'm going to give them some equipment. Everything is very cheap, so I'm able to equip them with lots of cards for very low cost. And then some conditions, some events. Oops. And now we've got the core. See, we are almost at the minimal limit of cards in our deck. And this is where I want to stop and think about the so-called meta. So let's say that the meta is Morgul Swarm. In general, it is very difficult for this deck to play against Swarm, because Swarm generally punishes the alternative ring bearers, since they are either weak somehow, or they have a punishment for being assigned to skirmish. And that is something that you can abuse with Swarm. So how do I react to that? Well, simply putting 4 copies of Aragorn with Defender in the deck. Or maybe another Aragorn that doesn't even need to exert himself. Now I've got 4 copies of Aragorn, so I probably want to play something that is going to keep him alive. Maybe. How does that work? It discards weapons. Well, perfect. Since dwarves are already a choke, I can play 2 copies of Bormer's Gauntlets. Maybe 1 more copy of Anduril. And now the deck is ready against Swarm. It is never going to die against Swarm, and it's going to be very comfortable for you to play against it. Another example. Let's say that a lot of people, for some reason, play Corruption. The easiest thing in the world. I can play 4 copies of Sam. And there we go. Then another example. Let's say that a lot of people play Southerns, and they just want to kill guys with wounds. Well, then I can play around. And so on. So this is generally how you want to react to the meta. We are going to now take a look at Shadow. So we are going to pair it up with, for example, Easterlings. The role of Easterlings is going to be to stop our opponent, because the Shadow doesn't have many ambitions to stop our opponents. Let's take a look at some core of the deck. We are going to add 1 Pillager. Now 2 copies of this, 4 copies of Small Hope, and then we are already in the core. So we put 2 burdens on board. Then we usually want to abuse the power of Raider Bow. So let's say that this could probably be the core of the deck. Now some people might say that it is impossible to play Easterlings without Polearm, but why? If my opponents play, for example, Gandalf, who definitely runs at least 2 copies of Roll of Thunder, Well, why am I going to have this in deck if the meta is Gandalf? It's useless. I rather want to do something extreme in order to deal with Gandalf. Now, how to do that? We already spoke about Sauron, but wait, there is a way in the Raider culture how to deal with Gandalf. Gandalf particularly doesn't like Fuse in Despair and other very strong events. So if I do something like this, and I can even help myself with playing a regiment, well then it is going to be much easier for me to beat that kind of deck. One more card missing, so for example the Ships of Great Drought, one of the best cards of this culture, and now I'm ready for the Gandalf meta. So I hope this helped. I hope it answered the question at least to some extent. If there are any more requests, I will be happy to create some more content for anybody who asks for it. Now, please enjoy the games and be out there on Gamp.